As I said, I was coordinator of the Haifa Shared City program and also coordinated a group called Leadership for Shared Society, which was organized. I was working for an NGO called Shatil of the New Israel Fund. And my PhD was partly about many issues, but what I want to talk about now is the way the past was used in the meetings of those groups and what happened. It's a bit scary because I understand so many of you are historians and talk about collective memory, and it is not completely my field of expertise, but I want to share some of my insights with you. I will be partly reading and partly talking to you. In his book, Imagined Communities, Benedict Anderson describes how the imagination of the shared past played an important role in shaping national consciousness. And Jeffrey White, describing how the Pearl Harbor survivors connect their personal stories to the national narrative, illustrates the power of this connection. In the present study, I want to explore the ways the personal and national narratives of Jewish and Arab activists who participated in a leadership course for shared society collide, contrast, or try to reconcile with the narratives of the other in a situation of ongoing violent conflict. And I also try to unravel the ways discussing the past promotes or hinders the creation of a truly shared society where everyone feels at home. My claim is that the solid connection between the personal and the national narratives and identities creates an explosive and paradoxical side when these meetings are dedicating to the past. For, on the one hand, the solid connection in which memory is presented invites identification with the nation and therefore separation and conflict. But on the other hand, the stories are told in a shared cross-border context, guided by the will for peace and reconciliation. So the result is a complex dance, one step forward, two steps back, in which the past serves both as a reason for conflict escalation as well as an invitation for a different future. Being an anthropologist, I want to start with an ethnographic vignette. So it is December 2014, and the Leadership Program for Shared Society, where I serve as academic coordinator, is meeting for 2 days in Haifa, my city. The program is organized by the New Israel Fund, in whose Haifa office I am the head of the Haifa Shared City program. The participants are activists trying to promote equality and improve the relations between Jews and Arabs in Israel. Later, the meetings of this course will be part of the ethnography on which I will base my PhD research. The purpose of the meeting this time is to learn about life, shared or not, in the city. And thus we are visiting the Haifa City Museum. The Haifa Shared City program tried to make Haifa a more shared city. The purpose of the meeting this time is to learn about the life in Haifa, and we are visiting the museum. While the custom in such local museums in Israel is to erase the Palestinian past and present the urban history as if it had begun during Zionist settlement or after 1948, the Haifa curator has taken a different decision. One of the museum's rooms is dedicated to a permanent exhibition where the city's rich Palestinian history is also presented. This is not at all usual, as the story of the city's history is still extremely controversial. This is the part of the museum which deals with the Palestinian. On the one side, you see the Israeli, but also the Palestinian history. 150,000 residents lived in Haifa in 1948. About 50% of them were Jews and 50% Arabs. When the Jewish forces conquered the city during the war, some 70,000 Palestinians who lived there were deported, expelled, or fled because they were incited to do so by their corrupt leadership, depending on whom you ask. Their homes remained empty and were later destroyed or became the homes of the many Jewish immigrants and Holocaust survivors who came to the city when the State of Israel was formally established a few weeks later. My own parents, who arrived in 1950, lived in a new neighborhood, but the ruins of the Palestinian part of the city were still there when I was growing up in Haifa in the 60s and 70s. In spite of their presence, the ruins were not a big issue at the time. Busy with rebuilding their own lives, the local history, and the people who lived beyond them, who lived there before them, and who somehow disappeared was not of no particular interest for our parents or us. 2008, when I became the coordinator of the Haifa Shared City program, that I learned about this secret unspoken of history. So for me, the museum's exhibition seems to be a brave step, even if the explicit history of 1948 is not described in so many words. But still, the fact that this history is mentioned, that the Haifa is seen the way it was before, I think that it is a meaningful step, and I want to show the participant that this is what is happening. In the lecture she is holding for members of the Shared Society Leadership course, the museum curator explains that her aim is to bring the different stories and histories. The museum decided to add Arabic as an additional language in all its publication and has set up an advisory committee of Palestinian researchers who accompanies her in her work. But still, the members of the group that I am leading are not very excited by that. From a Palestinian point of view, I think that what is happening in this museum is bad and distorted history, one of them will say in the discussion that will develop later in the meeting. He criticizes the fact that the leaders of the Palestinian resistance movement who fought against the Jews are not mentioned in the exhibition, let alone presented as heroes as he would like to see them. On the pages documenting the encounter, I will later find some sketches that I wrote to myself, wondering whether it is possible to develop some kind of shared narrative. I thought I did not want to live my whole life on the sword. I hope there was a chance. Now I do not know, says one of the Jewish participants in response to the comments. Another Jewish participant shares a dream where he is trying to escape from Auschwitz. Thus, as in countless other times, the Holocaust emerges again from the abyss, competing with the memory of the Nakba, the Palestinian catastrophe. Such an infrastructure make it possible to create a shared society or a shared city, as the vision of the leadership program suggests. According to White, the nation works hard to build and perpetuate the story of a shared past of all its members. This is very clear in this encounter, but what can we do to build a shared history and to see things together? In his doctoral thesis on reflexive coexistence in Haifa, Rekev Natanson argues that the discourse of segregation is embodied in the daily life and constitutes a knowledge regime that places people in different categories and legitimizes their separation from each other. However, he says, parallel to this conceptualization, the practice of border crossing and challenges of segregation all but abound. And yet, in the absence of appropriate categories of thought to describe them, in what Ulrich Beck calls methodological nationalism, his interviewees found it hard to conceptualize, justify, or even describe such encounters. The methodological nationalism is expressed inter alia in the assumption that history consists of a relationship between the two seemingly separate societies. While staying within this assumption, people tend to ignore the relations between the members of the two communities and the ways they shape each other. It also ignores cross-border encounters or third spaces as defined by Homi K. Baba, spaces that oppose binary categorization or go beyond. In my analysis, this is what happened during our visit to the Haifa Museum. Although prior to 1948 there were many cross-border cooperation between the communities, the effort to tell this story could not be perceived in the usual conflicting categories and was thus rejected. A similar fate awaited another story of the past that arose during another meeting of the leadership program, in which a counselor from the community center in the Arab village of Furadis described the history of friendly relationship between the residents of the village and the residents of two neighboring Jewish settlements. In 1948, the Jewish residents of these settlements assured the residents of the village that if they did not join the fighting forces, no harm would be done to them. Both sides kept their promise, and unlike the Haifa residents who had to flee, the residents of Furadis were able to stay in their homes. This story, in which members of the two conflicting groups preferred their neighborly relations over the demands of the national loyalty, was also ignored by the participants of the Shared Society Leadership Program, though it could have served as a trigger for discussing the tension between the interpersonal local relations and national demands, or about the ability to maintain intercommunal relations It was not discussed. History always occurs in the present. This is a story that the present tells about the past and its needs, says historian Eyal Naveh. It seems that, in the museum, since the story presented did not meet the significant needs of the group, which was mainly engaged in the national struggle, it did not become a focus of discussion, but was absolutely ignored, perhaps also seen as a source of shame by both sides. In an article describing the use of Lincoln's character by Barry Schwartz suggests several key ways in which the past can be used to meet the needs of the present. According to this suggestion, the past can be a source of legitimacy. It can create a basis for the struggle for values that the current struggle is a continuation of, or can be a source of consolation in times of crisis. But what happened in our case is that it was only a story of injustice as the basis for demand for recognition and reparation. The initial Jewish response to such stories is usually expressed in the willingness to listen, but when the demand arises not only to listen, but also to recognize the injustice, things get complicated, and the wish for apology is rarely fulfilled. So these are usually the kind of reactions that the Jews, and they say that although the Palestinians want the recognition as a basis for the discussion, the Jews usually do not agree, and it ends in some kind of deadlock. In an article describing the construction of life stories of children of Holocaust survivors as victims during the meetings of a second generation support group in the early 1990s, Carol Kidron describes how young people in their 30s or 40s, sons and daughters of Holocaust survivors, learn to retell their life stories as a failure resulting from the injury inflicted upon their parents a decade or more before they were born. She shows how, relying on psychological literature that attributes current difficulties to past trauma, many people tend to construct their life story as a story of victims, and later choose to stay in this role for the rest of their lives. While she claims this happens in the support groups, I wonder whether in the Jewish-Arab dialogue about the past does not reach similar results, with each side clinging to their victimhood and competing about who suffered more. Although we cannot ignore the past, I can't help but wonder whether these discussions lead us forward. So summing up this very short part of my research, I think we can conclude that, at least from my documentation, talking about the past may have helped both groups understand each other's history better, yet regrettably rarely contributes to building a better, more shared and equal future. This claim is repeated in a recently published book by Leah David called The Past Can't Heal Us. David, who is an Israeli who is originally from the former Yugoslavia, did her research about dialogue groups in two conflict situations, in Israel-Palestine and in Serbia and Croatia. In her book, she describes how the moral remembrance component of the human rights ideology developed mainly in the 90s, based on the South African Truth and Reconciliation Committee and similar experiences. The assumption of this discourse is that there is a universal psychological need to heal, forgive, and reconcile. This comes from Freud's psychoanalytic theory, which assumes that retrieving repressed painful memory is a necessary part of the healing process. However, David claims this assumption does not always work. She claims that the dialogue groups, which deal with the past, can be seen as rituals that are meant to create feelings of morality that recruits group members into action. But paradoxically, the goal of creating a shared society through trying to tell a story of a shared past leads to a redrawing of national boundaries, pushing for the homogenization of the conflicting ethnic groups. The participants start the encounters as individuals, but continue as symbolic representations of the national community. The primal identifications are strengthened, there is a simultaneous stream of accusations, no common humanity is created, but rather the opposite. The participants do not come out as one unified group, but rather as victims who then are stuck to their role, and victimizers who feel guilty and want to escape the guilt. In a recent Zoom talk about her book, David suggested that the best way to dialogue for a dialogue project is not to talk about the past, but rather to deal with the common day-to-day experience and the future, which Ran and Givat Chaviva are doing a lot of this kind of work. I believe that trying to work the methodological nationalism framework and looking at past collaboration may also be helpful. So there are no easy solutions, but we must invest more thought in the work that we are doing. Thank you.